The miracle of the seventh-day ox. The story of Nikolai Panchak, a Russian Seventh-day Adventist pastor imprisoned in a Siberian prison camp for his faith. In our last reading, Nikolai is now working with the ox to bring in 7 days' worth of water to the camp in 6 days, so that he could accept the challenge given to him by the kindly Russian officer and have his Sabbath days off. But old Maxim, the ox, is not cooperating. And this is Friday, his last day to bring in the quota, and it just seems impossible based on what has happened the rest of the week. We continue our reading in chapter 27 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Morning came too early for Nikolai. After all the moments of discouragement during the previous 2 days of work, Nikolai had begun to falter in his faith. And then he remembered that he had awakened in the night to a moment of inspiration, an amazing epiphany that his experience was actually very biblical. Like Gideon, Nikolai once again realized that he was going to have to trust in his Heavenly Father. He was going to have to place his faith in the one who could make all things work together for good. The day and the ultimate challenge had arrived, and Nikolai went out to meet them. He hurried to the barn to rouse old Maxim to the task of the day. But to his surprise, Maxim was already on his feet, his legs restless and his eyes fully alert. Well, this is a change, Nikolai mused. You're never on your feet this early in the morning. He gave the old ox a swat on the rump, and every day this week when he had come to the stables, he had always found Maxim lying down. But now, Maxim was yanking at his chain, ready to go. Nikolai threw old Maxim's harness over his neck and back and strapped it on. All right, old boy, he announced cheerfully, let's get going. For a moment, Nikolai's heart lifted at the thought of Maxim's high energy level. It was encouraging and even refreshing to see the animal finally in sync with the man. Of course, it was a bit late now, Nikolai mused to himself. But when Nikolai led Maxim out of the shed and hitched him to the cart, the animal lurched forward as though he were on his way to a race. Nikolai would have liked to have stopped by the kitchen for some cold turnips and Russian bread, as he had other mornings this week, but he never had a chance. Old Maxim headed out of the camp at a run, and it was all Nikolai could do to keep up with him. In fact, Nikolai ended up running all the way to the spring behind Maxim and the bouncing, bumping cart. When Maxim finally pulled the cart to a stop, his tongue was hanging out, and his soft beige coat was wet with sweat. Nikolai tried to catch his breath as he stepped up to the ox, now also breathing heavily. Wow, what was that all about? Was all Nikolai could say, as Maxim stood with his head down, his eyes rolling up in his head. Nikolai filled the water barrels and then pulled a rope from the cart and tied his barrels on securely. In case Maxim got any ideas about running again, Nikolai wanted the barrels to stay on the cart. He looked at the ox again. What was up with this big animal? The day before, the whole operation had nearly come to a grinding halt because Maxim had no energy. Now, he had enough energy for 10 oxen, and it appeared that he was running to beat all records. It was though someone had built a fire under him. Nikolai knew he couldn't afford to stand around wondering about this amazing spectacle that had occurred before his very eyes. He needed to capitalize on the opportunity Maxim was offering, the gift that God had given him. Nikolai quickly put the wooden lids on the barrels. The old ox had made the trip in such a short time that Nikolai had to wonder just how fast it had been. But he didn't have time to even think about it, because suddenly, as if on cue, the ox started out again. He strained against the harness until the cart was rumbling along at a fairly good pace. The old ox was moving at unheard of speeds. But the most bizarre thing about it all was the way Maxim was doing it. His big angular body was gliding along as if in fluid motion. His gait, steady and smooth, pulled the cart along without the lurching motion that usually came because of the play between the harness and the cart shafts. And then suddenly, Nikolai remembered a dream that he had had at the beginning of the week about Maxim and him racing to the spring. It had all been a wonderful fantasy then. Now, it was an exciting reality. Nikolai knew he had never seen anything quite like this. It was remarkable how the old animal had run to the spring on the first trip, but the return trip was even more incredible. No one would believe him if he had told them. They would have had to see it, even to comprehend it. How could he explain to them the peculiar sight of the ox trotting briskly along with heavy water barrels on a cart on an empty road in the wastelands of Siberia? The whole thing was just uncanny. And now, he and Maxim were making incredible time. The old ox ran and ran and ran. There was no doubt in Nikolai's mind that God was the source of Maxim's boundless energy. It was wonderful to see God demonstrating himself in this miraculous way. It was truly a marvel and an inspiration to the preacher. The real question was, why now? Why had God waited until the last day to help Nikolai? Of course, Nikolai knew the answer to that question. God wanted to remove all doubt from Nikolai's mind that there was anything he could do himself to work out his own miracle story. The end of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. And so the morning flew by. By noon, they had already made 5 trips. Nikolai was speechless. What could he say? God was performing an astonishing miracle and doing it in a way that Nikolai could never have predicted. All afternoon, the two of them hustled. Nikolai grew weary from his continual running after the ox and the cart. It was almost ridiculous. All week, he had been trying to get the ox to run, but he had failed miserably. Now, he was the one running, just to keep up with the ox, and it was wearing him out. After his regular trips to the box, his muscles had truly atrophied. But that was another incredible part about this whole amazing miracle. Nikolai had energy and full use of his legs. True, his leg muscles were no longer tough and sinewy as they had once been, but he was keeping up, and his legs weren't failing him. There was something to be said for that. Although he was growing bone weary and short of breath, he would not allow himself to ride in the cart, even if just out to the spring with the empty barrels. He knew he just couldn't take the chance of wearing the ox out. Old Maxim had to be nearing the breaking point. How could he sustain that speed and intensity for all these hours? Nikolai kept thinking that the ox would drop any minute, but he didn't. He just kept going and going and going. It was nothing short of a miracle indeed. Without a shadow of a doubt, nothing short of God's Spirit was keeping the ox on his feet. It was all so exciting how things had transpired. Nicholas dared not stop for fear they would somehow lose the momentum that Maxim had gained. By the time the shadows of late afternoon had turned to evening, they had completed 7 trips to the spring. They needed to make only one last trip. Would they make it by sunset? Was Nikolai pressing his luck at taking Maxim out one more time? Fortunately, Maxim had his own ideas. When Nikolai turned the cart around and paused to check the angle of the sun in the sky, the ox headed out of the camp without hesitation. Nikolai was famished, but he had no choice. He had to follow. He had managed to grab a loaf of bread when he drove by the kitchen about noon, but that was all that he had gotten to eat. That last trip to the spring was the hardest of all. It seemed to Nikolai that it would never end. By now, Maxim had slowed a bit, but the stop at the spring gave him a much-needed rest. He drank long and deep at the spring as he had so many times already that day. But when Nikolai put the lids on the barrels and turned the cart around, Maxim took off just like every other trip. Again, Nikolai had to run to keep up, but they both had their second wind now, and it was as if nothing could deter them. God had truly blessed them with a will and the energy to succeed. The Sabbath rest was looking really good by now. Never in his life had he looked forward so much to resting on the Lord's holy day. Never had he been so sure that God was working behind the scenes to perform a miracle to end all miracles, and all for the sake of a Russian pastor who had dedicated himself to honor God and his memorial of creation. As they raced across the steppes of the Siberian plain, the shadows lengthened even further. Many creatures were stirring for the evening now. The lemons were gathering by the score on the hummocks of sedge-grass, squeaking and chattering their rodent talk. A lone snowy owl eyed them again from his perch of tundra sod, and on the rise to the north, a half a dozen Russian prairie wolves were sitting, waiting for the moon to come up. They watched with interest as the man and ox raced by, the cart bumping and jostling along. Amazingly enough, Nikolai never even gave the wolves a thought. Ordinarily, he might have been afraid of their numbers, and maybe he should have been. But honestly, he really didn't have time to dilly-dally. He had a Sabbath to prepare for, and the camp was just in sight around the bend. This was not a time to be afraid of a wolf attack. God had performed a miracle for the preacher and the ox, and right now, Nikolai was sure 100 wolves would not have been able to detain them. Maxim pulled into the camp, his legs still trotting. Only when the cart pulled up to the kitchen did his legs stop churning. Only then did the man allow himself to stop and catch his breath. There sat the other 8 full barrels of water, waiting to be used the next day. The sun hadn't quite set, but it was very near to doing so. With God's help, Nikolai had completed the impossible task that he had set out to do. As he slid the barrels down the skid ramps set against the cart, Nikolai bowed his head and breathed a sigh of relief. The miracle was complete. There was no other explanation for the job they had been able to accomplish. God had truly done his part. In the far-reaching shadows of the waning day, a well-known verse came to Nikolai's mind. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 6. Never in Nikolai's life had a verse of Scripture held such meaning. Never had a text been so rich with significance. Truly, Nikolai had triumphed over the test that had threatened to undo his faith, and the victory was sweeter than anything he had ever experienced or imagined. The end of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. The last rays of the late setting summer sun were cutting across the landscape as Nikolai took Maxim to the stable. He hurriedly unhooked Maxim from the cart and pulled the harness from his neck and shoulders. Then he gave the tired ox some sedge grass and slapped him on the rump. I want you to enjoy this rest, Maxim. You deserve it. He stepped to the stable doorway and turned to the ox one last time. I hope you know I won't be coming for you tomorrow morning. We don't have to work at all tomorrow. We have earned a rest, both of us, and we're going to get it. Nikolai went to one of the water barrels, scooped some water out with a wooden bucket, and headed back to the barracks. It was time for a good bath. When he was dressed in the only other shirt and pair of clothes he owned, he went to the kitchen for something to eat before Petya closed the kitchen for the night. As usual, he was late for supper. But as usual, Petya had a bowl of borscht waiting for him. He also had a side order of Russian black bread and a rare slab of cheese. Well, this is a delicacy. Nikolai smiled as he savored a bite of the yellow cheese. Where'd you get it? It's got to be the best treat I've seen in camp yet. An old man who lives not far from here has a few reindeer he's tamed. He milks some of the does and then makes cheese. I was surprised, the cook added, cutting off a thin slice of the cheese for himself. It does taste pretty good for reindeer cheese. But then again, I've never eaten reindeer cheese before, so I guess I don't know what it's supposed to taste like. After supper, Nikolai ambled over to the warden's office to give him the news. He had managed to haul the needed water barrels for the Sabbath hours. The warden looked up from his desk in surprise. You've got 10 barrels in camp right now, full of water? Yes, sir. Nikolai tried not to sound too happy. He didn't want the warden to think of some extra task he might need done. That would be a dirty trick, even for the warden, Nikolai thought. Very well then, Panchak. Go on and rest. You deserve it. I understand you've been putting in some pretty late nights. The warden turned back to what he had been doing. Oh, and Panchak, he added, as he stared at Nikolai over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses. What was going on with the ox today? They told me the animal was going wild on you, wouldn't stop running. Nikolai smiled sheepishly. Yes, sir. He was a bit overwrought. Overwrought? The warden nearly burst out laughing. According to everyone who saw him, he was more like crazy. Yes, sir. I'd have to agree with you there. A bit crazy. I can't account for it. But he was, well, we'll just say God helped us get the water in. How could Nikolai explain what he really thought? That God had spooked the old ox or put a bug in his ear, or given him a shot of adrenaline that had lasted all day? Perhaps he should have told the warden more about the power of God. Perhaps. But then it didn't matter, because the warden didn't really want to know and was waving him off. And so the Sabbath began for Nikolai. He didn't flaunt his time off. Instead, he stayed inside the barracks and prayed most of the day. The other prisoners all went to their work assignments, so he had the time to himself. Even the guards left him alone. Over and over, he thanked God for the miracle performed on his behalf. God had indeed done a marvelous thing, and he had done it with a dumb ox. The whole thing reminded Nikolai of the story in the Bible in which God had used a donkey to be his mouthpiece. The donkey hadn't really wanted to be a part of the whole adventure, but like Maxim, he had been drawn unwittingly into the grand plot of the story when Balaam decided to disobey God. On the road to Moab, an angel of God tried to prevent Balaam and his donkey from going on a mission to curse Israel. Balaam didn't know that, of course, and he gave the donkey the beating of its life. The poor old donkey put up quite a fuss and then started talking. Nikolai thought about the similarities between Maxim and Balaam's donkey. Like Balaam's donkey, Maxim had been used by God to be his witness. Like the donkey, Maxim was part of a wonderful miracle that might very well be told down through the years of time. The day turned out to be a grand day for rest and relaxation for Nikolai, and he enjoyed the fruit of his labors with relish. He couldn't remember when he had felt a more complete peace. And he slept some. He deserved it, he felt, for all the nights of short sleep and for having to run behind the ox cart all day on Friday. He figured that he had run some 15 or 16 miles. Nikolai went to the mess hall somewhere near sunset. All of the men had already eaten when he arrived, so Petya let him come back into the kitchen and eat there so that they could talk. The end of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Is it true? The cook asked, a gleam of admiration in his eye. Nikolai smiled humbly. You mean about old Maxim? Exactly. I know you got your quota of barrels, but I also heard that you brought in 8 cartloads of water in one day. Nikolai shrugged his shoulders and kept on smiling. That's 16 barrels of water, preacher man. Nikolai knew Petya wasn't making fun. The name sounded more like a term of endearment coming from Petya. That's right. It's more than I ever managed before. Ha! Petya grunted. I hear it's a record. More than anyone ever hauled in one day. That's so. Nikolai knew he had to share the whole story with Petya. He couldn't let Petya think that it had been his doing, or even old Maxim's for that matter. If anyone would understand, Petya would. I can't take credit for all that water I hauled yesterday. Petya stared at him with raised eyebrows. That's right. You see, I'm a man of prayer, Petya. After those 2 years in the box, I learned to depend on God for everything. He helped me deal with the pain and hunger. He gave me peace of mind when I needed it most. And I thank Him, especially for life. I owe Him my life many times over. So your God helped you haul all that water? How did He do that? by giving old Maxim super amounts of stamina and energy and inspiration, strength enough to go all day, running constantly without even stopping to eat, and inspiration to do it in the first place. A little water and a few carrots I brought along for him was all that he had. Petya shook his head. Well, I did find the part about the ox almost unbelievable. Does the warden know all of this? I don't think so. I didn't tell him. He didn't ask. Petya sat on a stool staring at Nikolai. Did you ask God to do that for you? I didn't ask him to do that specifically for me because I didn't know it was possible. Nikolai shook his head. But I did ask my God to please help me find some way to haul enough water so that I wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath. So your God came up with this, huh? Pretty neat. Petya looked pensive. Does your God help everyone who asks? Everyone who comes to him in faith. Everyone who seeks him with all their heart, soul, and mind. And that's what you do? As a Christian pastor, I must say I have always done that by his grace. There was silence in the kitchen for quite some time. The only sound that could be heard was the sound of the hot kitchen stove popping and snapping as it slowly cooled for the night. Would he do such a thing for me? Petya asked earnestly, and Nikolai could hardly believe his ears. Here was a man wanting God to come into his life and touch him. This man was asking the essential question of every seeker who had ever come to Jesus. What must I do to be saved? Nikolai went to bed that night, inspired and energized for another week. What the week would bring was anybody's guess. But one thing was for sure. He would have more time this week, so he wouldn't have to kill himself or Maxim. He wouldn't have to run the ox into the ground every day to get the water he would need. This week, he would need to bring in 70 barrels of water in 6 days. Earlier than usual the next morning, Maxim was in the barn, hitching up Maxim to the cart. But strangely enough, Maxim was in no hurry to get going. It was as if all the energy had gone out of his bones, as if he had used up Sunday's energy supply on Friday. Try as he might, Nikolai was powerless to get old Maxim going. By the end of the day, they had managed to bring in only 10 barrels of water, and they had to work after dark to do it. Monday was no better. It seemed that the harder Nikolai pushed Maxim, the slower he moved. Did the old ox know something Nikolai didn't? Was he playing some kind of silly game to pit his wits against the man? Was it some kind of standoff again, where Maxim did what he wanted, when he wanted? Or was it nothing of the sort? Had the previous Friday just been a freak accident of nature? Had it been an incredible, unexplainable phenomenon of animal behavior that no one had ever seen and would never see again? Nikolai hoped that on Tuesday he might make up for the loads he had failed to haul on the first 2 days of the week. But Tuesday was a bust too, and the outcome worried Nikolai, leaving him feeling frustrated and confused. He was now getting up so early every morning that he had to wonder if he was losing touch with reality. What kind of life was this? He was going to bed at night after everyone else, and then getting up before anyone in the camp had even stirred. By dawn, he and Maxim were usually already on their way to the spring. On Wednesday, they made some progress. Old Maxim seemed to have new life in his step once again, and he moved with purpose all that morning. By mid-afternoon, it was clear to Nikolai that they would be able to bring in at least 7 loads. That was an extra 4 barrels toward his goal of 10. Nikolai was still holding out hope that there might be a chance of filling his quota by Friday night. Maxim was moving with purpose now, and he didn't let up all day. Nikolai felt so good about the rate at which they were working that he now found himself singing an old hymn. "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, still may we dwell secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure." Nikolai could feel the power of the Holy Spirit beside him out there on the lonely road to the spring. He raised his hands to the sky as he sang the final verse of the old hymn in a throaty baritone voice. "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guide while life shall last, and our eternal home." Nikolai went to bed that night, feeling that the day had been a success, but he secretly dreaded the coming of another day. What chance did he have of making the quota? If he could somehow haul 7 loads the next day, it would be their only hope. 7 loads on Thursday would give them a total of 8 barrels toward the extra 10 that they needed. But he knew they could haul no less. Even so, that would still leave them with another 6 trips needed on Friday. Unfortunately, Thursday was a bomb again. Maxim was back to his old tricks of poking along the windswept road to the spring. If the situation hadn't seemed so serious to Nikolai, he might have taken the time to feel sorry for the old ox. Now, all he had time for was exasperation. At the end of the long day, they had managed to bring in a measly 10 barrels. They had made only 5 trips, 2 trips short of his goal. They were now 6 barrels short of the tally they would need to bring in by Friday sunset. And with that realization, still far short of their goal, all of Nikolai's hopes died. The end of chapter 30 of the miracle of the 7th day ox.